Reno has served as editor of First Things since 2011. He received his Ph.D. in theology from Yale University and taught theology and ethics at Creighton University for 20 years. Reno has published in many academic journals, and his opinion essays have appeared in a rather large range, a wide range of journals. His most recent books include The End of Interpretation, Return of the Strong Gods, Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, Fighting the Noonday Devil, Sanctified Vision, and a commentary on the book of Genesis. I look forward to hearing from him. Please join me in welcoming him to our podium.
Well, thanks to Providence College for putting on this wonderful conference. It's a real service, I think, to the church to be able to gather and talk about matters of importance facing our society today. And it's always a pleasure to come to Providence, and given the theme of the conference and friendship, to see my wonderful friends Jim and Sandra Keating, whom I've known for a long time, from before their Providence College days. Jim reminded me that we met in my home in Omaha, Nebraska, and one of my colleagues in the theology department at Creighton University said to Jim, "You got to meet this guy, Rusty Reno. He's as outrageous as you are." And that's saying a lot. Jim Keating's pretty stiff competition when it comes to oh, I don't know. I'm going to be in the same vein as Ken Myers. I think he raised some very important points about the role of friendship in political life. And my talk is going to start with a diagnosis of the problems facing our country today, and it's really only in the second part that I'll get to this issue of friendship and the role of friendship in sustaining a unified country. So that's my basic line of attack in this talk. Fourth speaker, I guess that puts me in the cleanup spot, right? The fourth keynote speaker. If you have four keynotes, and what are the rest of the notes? You know, yeah, every lecture is a keynote? I don't know about that. So, e pluribus unum, out of many one. Not without reason, we worry that the current trend is in the opposite direction. Ex uno multus, out of one, many. The ideology of multiculturalism undermines our ability to transmit a coherent and unifying public culture to the next generation, and this comes on top of demographic change that has made the country more diverse. And of course, many of the speakers have spoken on this, woke activism atomizes the body politic into these various identity groups. And of course, in this context, political rhetoric has become more heated, and the country is increasingly polarized. Hence my title of my talk, Civic Friendship and Polarization. Or is it Friendship in the Age of Polarization? I can't remember exactly what title I gave. I think Ken Myers pointed out that you give titles and themes to the the conference organizers before you actually write the lecture. But I actually stayed pretty close to my stated theme. Now, I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of dire predictions about a coming civil war. Over the last 30 years, media has evolved in such a way that extremism pays, and in fact, it pays handsomely. Pundits are thus encouraged to predict catastrophes: climate catastrophe, economic catastrophe, demographic catastrophe, and of course, political catastrophe, civil war, and so forth. And many on the left are quick to warn of rising fascism. At the same time, conservative commentators predict the triumph of socialism. Given the strong incentives to preach what I call doomerism, we should all take this with a very large grain of salt. And it's not just that doomerism gets clicks and pays. We are also living in an age, and other people have spoken about this, an age of an often distorting anxiety, an anxiety that distorts our ability to read the signs of the times accurately. My grandfather was born at the end of the horse and buggy era and lived to see a man on the moon. It was easy for him to believe in progress. And my father, born in the Great Depression, came of age during the great post-war boom. To this day, he trusts that the many bumps in the road do not disprove his belief that the arc of history bends towards moral and material improvement. By contrast, today's watchword is sustainability. It seems that the most we can hope for is to avoid disaster. This sentiment of foreboding likewise needs to be taken with a grain of salt. As I tell young people, when it comes to the affairs of men, it's never as good as it seems, and it's never as bad as it seems. Nevertheless, just because it's not as bad as it seems doesn't mean it's not bad. I think there are things to worry about, and I'll look at some of the things that I do think indicate or help explain the polarization of our present moment. 10 years ago, Charles Murray published Coming Apart, more than 10 years ago now. It's an important study of the economic and social composition of white America in the 21st century as compared to 1960. And he restricted his research to white Americans because he wanted to put aside important questions of race, as well as the implications of the dramatic increase in immigration since the Immigration Act of 1965. What Murray found was shocking. 70 years ago, working class, middle class, and professional class white Americans enjoyed relative unity. They shared the same moral outlooks and social norms. By and large, they went to the same schools and lived in relative proximity to each other. That's no longer the case. Today, the prosperous top 20% might as well be living in a different country from the bottom 30%. And in this growing coming apart, the middle ground, the middle 50%, is eroding and, of course, is deeply anxious. A lot of the anxiety is that you're either going up in our society or you're going down. I still go rock climbing on occasion. I have young friends, rock climber. One of my young friends grew up in Gary, Indiana. His father's an electrician at a steel mill. I lived in the same house with the same wife, for 35 years. 4 children, 4 sons, 2 of whom very successful, including the one that I go rock climbing with, and 2 of whom had father illegitimate children, one of whom has spent time in jail for drug dealing, the other of whom had to be institutionalized for substance abuse. So he could not transmit to his own children a sort of stable, relatively prosperous, but middle class life. You're either going up or you're going down. I think that's one of the great sources of anxiety in our time. And I draw attention to Murray's book because we're often encouraged to take a false view of polarization in America. Black Lives Matter exploded onto the scene in summer 2020. We had a preview of it with the Ferguson affair in 2014 or 2015. I can't remember the exact dates. And this explosion onto the scene gave the impression that the most significant and debilitating divide in American society is racial. Now, I don't want to downplay the realities of race in America, but those realities are long-standing, which means that it is implausible to think that today's polarization runs along the color line. By my reading, the events of 2020, by my reading of those events in 2020, Black Lives Matter is important because of the role it played among white Americans. So the division it created among white Americans, the sort of east side of, what's the East Hill called here in Providence? Is it just called East? The east side and all of its signs, lawn signs versus the west side. And that's a division in white America. That's not a division between Black America and white America. And I'd also like to set aside demographic change. The United States reached peak homogeneity in the 1970s when less than 5% of the population of the country was non-native born. That percentage has increased every year since then, reaching 13% by 2010, and today closing in on 15% non-native born. And that equals the highest levels in our nation's history. Now, a dramatic increase in immigration certainly strains any country's capacity to maintain social cohesion. As sociological research shows, ethnic and cultural diversity reduce social trust. Contrary to what President Obama wished us to believe, diversity is not our strength. It's a challenge. It's our challenge. But this challenge, again, I would submit, has little to do with the political and cultural polarization that threatens to shipwreck our society. When Hillary Clinton made her disparaging and unguarded remark about the basket of deplorables, she was not referring to recently arrived immigrants or to the black urban underclass. She was targeting white Americans. So it was a white American targeting white Americans. So let me try to be more specific. Around the same time that the Murray book came out, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia produced a detailed report on family life titled The Culture, or maybe it's the Cultures of American Families. The study identified 4 distinct family cultures: the faithful, the progressive, the detached, and the American dreamers. Detached families are not very functional. They're often broken, often burdened by poverty, drug abuse, violence, and other social problems. In other words, the detached are not setting the tone for American society. American dreamers want their kids to move up the ladder. Often, American dreamer families are immigrant families. And these parents, the parents in the American dreamer family, take their cues from the dominant culture, and they work hard to make sure that their children meet those expectations. So that obviously raises the question, who sets the expectation? Who defines the dominant culture to which the American dreamers want to assimilate into? That's the key question that drives polarization. And if you dive into the survey data in this study, you immediately see that the political and cultural battles of recent decades are rooted in a conflict between the culture of the faithful family and the culture of the engaged progressive family. You know, Jesus taught that where your treasure is, there is your heart also. I would like to add extend that. Where your children are, there is your heart also. And so these family cultures really, what you want for your children is, you can say certain things and hold certain political views, but the question is, what are you doing with your children? That really is a very telling indication of what your deepest beliefs and convictions are. Now, I won't go into detail here, but some data points are telling. Among the faithful, Republicans outnumber Democrats 4-1. Among engaged progressives, the reverse is true. Democrats outnumber Republicans 4-1. Engaged progressives, this is really a great data point, engaged progressives emphasize the importance of diversity and inclusion. These parents want their children to have friends of different races and ethnic backgrounds. But there is one striking exception. Engaged professionals do not want their children to befriend evangelical Christians. It's really interesting in the study. That's the one category I don't want my children influenced by evangelical Christians. Now, I submit, therefore, that polarization in the United States is rooted in an ideological struggle between these 2 strands. And ultimately, these 2 strands of the American family are rooted in American Christianity. So really, it's a struggle within American Christianity. It is not caused by racial antagonisms, real as they may be, nor ethnic diversity, real as that may be. These are fragmenting realities, racial antagonisms and ethnic diversities, to be sure, and they certainly weaken our solidarity. But that phenomenon is not what we mean by polarization. So let's look at those strands of American Christianity. Because it seems to me that I'm very much influenced by David Hollinger, who is a historian of 20th century American religion, who makes a very powerful case and shows in detail the way in which American progressivism has its roots in liberal Protestant Christianity. So the two strands. One strand is the conservative and populist Protestant tradition that runs back to Cane Ridge and the Second Great Awakening. And it's being supplemented in recent decades by conservative Catholics and Orthodox Jews. First Things Magazine, to a certain extent, is a voice for this constituency. The other strand finds its roots in liberal Protestantism and its offshoots, such as Unitarianism, Transcendentalism, and the many movements of progressive reform that were sponsored by mainline Protestant churches in the early to mid-20th century. This is what David Hollinger does such a good job of showing in his scholarly work. By the 1960s, the liberal Protestant strand was becoming secularized. And in the process, it incorporated into itself the European traditions of progressivism. And as a sidebar here, I'd say that many conservative commentators wrongly imagine that German imports, such as the Frankfurt School, injected a kind of alien cultural Marxism into the American bloodstream. I think this narrative ignores the fact that Herbert Marcuse was lionized because he dovetailed with the American tradition of spiritualism, utopianism, and perfectionism that run back to Anne Hutchison and Roger Williams. I mean, I made my pilgrimage to the First Baptist Church in America. Roger Williams was a perfectionist utopian, if you ever want to meet one. And I think his progeny are, the sort of women my age, waspy women my age with Patagonia jackets giving out literature on, gender affirming, whatever, I think there's a direct line that goes through that strand. Now, the conservative Protestant tradition also adopted secular elements, such as Cold War anti-communism and free market economics. But in my estimation, we can identify a striking continuity in our cultural conflicts that run back at least 100 years. That conflict is epitomized by the famous Scopes trial in 1925, when one of that era's towering figures, William Jennings Bryan, pushed back against the dehumanizing materialism of evolutionary science, only to be mocked by the coastal cognoscenti as an ignorant rube. H.L. Mencken did his own version of Basket of Deplorables in 1925. So let me draw this digression to a close with some observations. First, the polarization we are experiencing today is not new. To the contrary, our country has often been polarized along similar lines. Women's suffrage and prohibition were great crusades more than a century ago. Those movements were led by society's improvers, the progenitors of 20th century Anglo-Protestants who sponsored people like Margaret Sanger and other cultural revolutionaries who continue to function today. And those improvers were resisted by a coalition of intransigents, as they are still in our time. My second observation notes that the conflicts that have divided the nation and continue to do so concern fundamental values, or what I call shared loves. The old and ailing William Jennings Bryan did not go to Dayton, Tennessee, in order to debate school policy. He meant to put before the American public a spiritual choice. He argued for a view of man as created in the image of God, and he argued against a secular materialism that sees us as one species of animals among others. Carl Trueman mentioned that he saw this as an anthropological crisis, the issues that we're facing. I mean, obviously, again, that crisis and polarization around that crisis goes back at least to the Scopes trial. There was a question of what does it mean to be human that was dividing that Brian wanted to press to force a referendum in favor of the biblical view. Now, in breezy histories of religion in America, we're told that fundamentalist Christians went into hibernation after the Scopes trial because of the scorn heaped upon Brian by influential arbiters of public opinion, such as H.L. Mencken, whom I mentioned. I think it is more accurate to say that the spiritual question of America's future was overwhelmed by the Great Depression and then set aside during the total mobilization of the country after Pearl Harbor. Both events were felt as defining crises for those who lived through them, and they produced the remarkable solidarity that characterized the 1950s, a solidarity that seemed to transcend theological and metaphysical divisions in American society. You had books like Beyond Ideology and The Vital Center, and these are the 1950s. There was a kind of feeling that we'd gotten beyond any kind of, deep ideological conflict. Now, but it turns out that view was not accurate. And as the post-war era exits its initial phase, and the glue of shared experience of crisis weakened, the metaphysical question that Brian litigated at the end of his life returned as a divisive question. We all know that John Paul II consistently argued that the 20th century West is afflicted by an anthropological crisis, as Carl said. And it's a crisis because we base our public life on a thin and false view of what it means to be human. Now, this is mostly Catholic audience here, and most of you don't know that in 1975, Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop published What Happened to the Human Race, which is essentially the same analysis as presented by Pope John Paul II in his pontificate. Today's transgender ideology, it just seems to me this crisis brought to a fever pitch. Because this ideology severs the relation, and we've been through this in this conference many times, it severs the relation between embodiment and identity, making explicit the essential issue running through our cultural conflicts, conflicts that continue to roil our public life. And basically, the issue is this: does nature have authority over our lives, or can we fashion and refashion without limits? After Virtue, another book that was mentioned, Carl mentioned, was published more than 40 years ago, and in that book, Alistair McIntyre framed the choice we face. Will we have a society anchored by truth, or will it be defined by power? It's kind of the central, is it going to be either Nietzsche, power, or Aristotle? So I recall that's the penultimate chapter in After Virtue. This choice, I think, offers the best way to think about the so-called culture wars that have raged hot and cold since the 1960s. Because my thesis is that Brian frames the question that the conflict over this question is overwhelmed by the crisis and subordinated by the crisis of the Great Depression and, of course, wartime mobilization, where everything falls away aside from the singular goal. From abortion to gay marriage, the sexual revolution succeeded in inscribing into our law the presumption that nature has no authority, to say nothing of God. Yet a powerful minority, especially religious conservatives, have refused to ally themselves with that metaphysical choice. In many respects, that dissident minority, those of us in this room, have actually grown stronger rather than weaker since the 1960s. We've gone numerically fewer, but I think intellectually and stronger. It's clearer in our minds what it is we're up against in 2023 than was the case in 1973. Many evangelical churches kind of acquiesced to Roe v. Wade initially, It really took a couple, 3 years for them to recognize really what was at stake. Put simply then, like the liberal Protestants who imagined that they had defeated the so-called fundamentalists when Bryan was humiliated, only to see them return in force a generation later. You know, the 1950s, the foundation of Christianity Today, I think in 1949, was founded by Billy Graham and other folks to be a voice of Protestant America. They thought in terms of America, Protestant America, to contest with the Christian Century, the vehicle for liberal Protestant opinion, to contest with it for who speaks for America, assuming that Protestants, of course, speak for America. And I would say as a sidebar that it's still a Protestant country. Catholics are just onlookers to an ongoing battle between liberal Protestants and conservative, secularized liberal Protestants and conservative Protestants. So just like they were sort of shocked and horrified to see that the once hidden fundamentalist Christians were back on the stage of history in the 1970s as a religious right, this outraged the liberal Protestant, now secularized establishment. Today's progressives have also failed to establish a settled, authoritative consensus about what it means to be human. As a consequence, they are increasingly frustrated, angry, and punitive. To a great degree, today's polarization stems from the fact that progressives are sick and tired of any suggestion that the anthropological question is an open question. And they are pressing for final victory, like, enough, we're tired of this. This is why sort of woke cancel culture is, we're not debating this anymore. The question has been answered. Nature has no authority. We live in a world where human intelligence can fashion and refashion the conditions of our existence without any limitation. And one reason that transgender ideology has so much support among elites is it dovetails with all kinds of technological projects, whether it's life extension or feminist concerns about technology to facilitate freezing your eggs when you're a professional woman. And also it ultimately ties in with, I think, a transhumanism hopes of, if not immortality, some kind of radical life extension, right? You can't let nature have authority in this Baconian project of a technological society. So this obviously raises a question. So I pose this frame. Polarization is a long-standing religious conflict in America between liberal Protestant, descendants of liberal Protestantism, and a kind of conservative Christian view. And it turns on this anthropological question that has been identified by many. So this obviously raises a question, and this will be the second thrust of my talk. Can a society operate when the question of what it means to be human is an open question? Aristotle writes this: the demands of justice, and this is Ken Myers, I think, worked on this in much more detail than I can. The demands of justice seem to increase with the intensity of friendship. He says that in Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. In other words, the integrity of a nation rests in what I call civic friendship. And as Aristotle teaches, the deepest friendship involves unity in pursuit of the highest good. Or to use my language, the tighter the bonds of shared loves, the more motivated we will be to build a just society for everyone. And we are now at odds over the fundamental question of what it means to be human. So how can we hold together, how can we have civic friendship without agreement with regard to an answer to that question? So to investigate, to answer that question, how can we hold together, I think we should turn to the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle notes that friendship admits of different kinds. Although the highest friendship rests in the shared conception of what makes life worth living, there are other lesser types of friendship. Some are based on shared pleasure, as in the case of drinking buddies or among people who are charming travel companions. Other friendships rely on usefulness. We might be friends with our business associates, or we are friends with our sports teammates without whom we cannot field a team. In his Politics, Aristotle makes cognate arguments, observations about what I call civic friendship. He doesn't use that term, but I would call it civic friendship. He notes that communities can form around a shared pursuit of money-making. To a significant degree, this obtains in the United States. Immigrants often largely come because America is the land of economic opportunity. And moreover, any politician will tell you that it's a lot easier to govern in a growing economy where there's lots of wealth to spread around. Whether we want to call it a friendship of pleasure or that of utility, money-making is a kind of ambiguous enterprise, actually. Is money something you use to get pleasure, or does it bring pleasure of its own accord? But however we want to describe that kind of friendship, there can be little doubt that we remain knit together in the United States as a kind of commercial empire. California and Texas may exemplify two poles of our current political conflict, but the two states have a shared interest in America's economic well-being. It's a very powerful bond. Aristotle also observes that battle fuses men together. The fight for communal survival promotes solidarity. It was to be expected, therefore, that post-war America would enjoy a long period of social and political unanimity after World War II. It was a consensus that was so solid that many left-wing intellectuals described in the early 1960s, they described our elections as contests between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Now, the war in Ukraine and China's muscle flexing has yet to pitch our country into mobilization, anything like what was undertaken during World War II. Nevertheless, it is true that we are tensing ourselves for global competition in the United States. And this is almost certain to dampen the hostilities triggered by polarization and to renew a modicum of solidarity in the face of an external enemy. There's a friendship of the foxhole, so to speak, and we're likely to benefit from that phenomenon in the coming decade. Now, material well-being and physical survival, they can motivate civic friendship of a certain sort. But Aristotle did not think one could build a genuine political society, what Ken Myers identified as communitas, solely on these bases. And I agree with Aristotle. A political community, in Aristotle's sense, is one animated by a shared sense of ownership. It is political because its members, in a certain sense, active in the making of laws, norms, and mores. And in a small Greek democracy, this activity was explicit in a kind of all-hands-on-deck debates about civic affairs. Now, large-scale democracies feature a much more attenuated participation, obviously. Citizens can speak out, they can agitate, they can vote in elections, but we don't make laws. Nevertheless, civic life, participation in civic life need not be explicit in order to be real and efficacious, for that matter. It can be tacit and implicit. For example, the English common law tradition treats prevailing custom and practice as presumptively authoritative. I mean, it's a democracy of the dead, as Chesterton referred to it as. So it's a sense that the way we do things has standing, and the authorities above can't just change things willy-nilly. And moreover, widespread habits of law-abiding behavior are a kind of tacit vote of confidence in the regime, attesting to a certain kind of ownership. Now, of course, nobody owns society, but the metaphor indicates a shared sense that we're invested in our political community. It's interesting how the commercial metaphors become inevitable when you talk about the relation of citizens to the regime. This kind of civic friendship begins to take the form of Aristotle's ideal of true friendship. This kind of civic friendship, shared sense of ownership, transcends the pleasurable and the useful, and it brings into play our beliefs about what makes life worth living. We care about the things we own, and our citizenship. We want our deepest beliefs to at least not be contradicted. A political society can be riven by fierce debates about policy, but it presumes a shared common conception of the highest good, I would submit. We quarrel as we row the ship of state, but we do so with the confidence that we're all trying to pull in the same direction. The confidence that we share the same loves has obviously eroded in the United States, and that is why we're increasingly anxious about whether we can hold together as a nation. Now, of course, as a political tradition, liberalism urges us to moderate the demands that we put on political community. We should not, liberalism teaches, expect government to enact all aspects of our conception of the highest good. I mean, the Bill of Rights not only prohibits the establishment of religion, but it also restricts the power of government in many other ways. To moderate, however, is not the same as to eliminate. Even the most thoroughgoing liberal must reckon with the fact that a genuine political community requires civic friendship. That is to say, bonds based on higher loves that transcend commercial advantage and common defense. Now, at this moment in our history, I find myself ambivalent about our prospects. In other words, do we have enough, do we share enough higher loves? Or is there enough of a shared conception of the highest good? Just enough to be able to get us, just enough, and I'm ambivalent. On the one hand, the rainbow juggernaut is powered by a metaphysical attack on reality, now glaringly evident, as I said, in transgender ideology. It's difficult for me to see how those of us who cleave to the doctrine of creation, or for that matter, just to science and reality, how can we share a country with those who believe that everything, even our bodies, are raw material for us to manipulate and remake as we see fit? On the other hand, so on the one hand, pessimism. Where's the black cloud? Yeah, there he is. On the other hand, as I go through my day, and I find that most people, most of the time, are identifiably American. We seem somehow to endure as a political society in spite of what amounts to a metaphysical polarization. So my theory tells me bad news. My experience tells me it's not as bad as the theory would predict. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what we share before concluding with a return to my concerns that we're losing the foundations for genuine civic friendship. Now, C.S. Lewis observed that friendship often begins in the discovery that another person shares our passions, shares our vision of what really matters. For this reason, I cannot become a friend of someone whom I have not met. Civic friendship is different. It works on presumption. We don't run around issuing loyalty tests. Rather, we assume that our fellow citizens are with us on essential matters, sort of presumption of innocence in a certain way, a presumption of unity. Against this background, we can fight electoral battles without worrying that we're making mortal enemies. In my estimation, there remains grounds for some of the assumptions that undergird civic friendship. For example, I mean, there are some things that we do seem to share that are not just material advantage or protection against foreign enemies. For example, American society is remarkable in its veneration of the federal Constitution. That document and ancillary documents such as the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, long-standing traditions such as judicial review, the nine-justice Supreme Court, the Senate filibuster, all these things command a great deal of respect. They serve as something like the American Torah. Or do they? One of the troubling signs of the times is that has been the relative decline in piety towards the Constitution and our various other ancillary traditions. And I have the impression that the latest generation or two of high school students have had they're far less likely than older Americans to receive a decent education in civics. And longstanding politicians in Washington report less trust that the opposition will play by the rules. We definitely have a problem. And maybe that's to be expected, this kind of decline in constitutional piety. After all, our nation was set up to function without a shared religious conviction, explicitly religious conviction. But nevertheless, it presumed metaphysical assumptions, the famous nature and nature's God formulation from the Declaration of Independence. And it seems, as I've argued, these assumptions are no longer shared, these metaphysical assumptions. And yet, I look, again, I see other signs of unity. Many speak of the American creed, by which they mean a set of ideals, not documents or procedures. And by my reckoning, this creed is not altogether coherent, because it embraces both freedom and equality, which are often at odds with each other. But count me among those willing to live with that paradox, since I am, in fact, romanced by both sides. And I think most Americans are. Consider freedom. A supermajority of Americans are jealous of our collective freedom to set our own course as a nation. Unlike European elites, Americans, including those who lead our country, rebel against the idea that our laws can be reviewed by a higher power. And although we are members of the United Nations, WTO, NATO, and other international organizations, our supereminent economic and military power puts us in a commanding position and allows us to control, veto, or ignore anything that threatens our national sovereignty. I see very little sign that my fellow citizens wish to diminish our freedom as a nation in that respect. In my estimation, the real threats to American freedom probably come from the billionaire oligarchs and their Great Reset allies. You know, we got John Kerry. He is a billionaire, or he's married to a billionaire. So I do think that this spirit of national sovereignty is extremely strong and very unifying. The spirit, and that's not a utilitarian. That's not a principle of utility. I think Europeans have decided that giving up national sovereignty is actually in the best interests of the country, viewed economically and in terms of in other material terms. And the spirit of equality is another trait that unites Americans. Whether they are attending Trump rallies or cheering on Nancy Pelosi, count me. I think there is a spirit of equality that transcends the polarized divide. Count me among those who cherish our American informality and our conviction that the rich and successful are no better than anyone else. C.S. Lewis, another area. C.S. Lewis identifies language, especially local dialects, as a source of collective pride. This may be a less powerful factor in the United States, where our patterns of speech have become homogenized by broadcast media, and we often talk in slogans and cliches. But I think too many American commentators overlook our distinctively American rhetoric. Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, Walt Whitman's poems, Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speeches. And then, of course, there's the Bible, especially the King James translation. And I would add, I think Ken Myers mentioned the importance of song. Did you? Was that you, Ken, that mentioned song? Yeah. The Great American Songbook, I think, by which I mean not only patriotic songs, but Irving Berlin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Robert Johnson, Woody Guthrie, Louis Armstrong, Hank Williams, very important figure, and Billie Holiday. Carl Truman, if he were here, would be very disappointed I didn't mention any rock and roll artists. But I think that's more of an instrument of American cultural imperialism than anything else. So civic friendship arises from shared loves. And in a time of polarization, it's a consolation to learn that the folks on the other side of the aisle thrill to the same distinctively American phrases, lyrics, and tunes. And further, Lewis observed that love of place is something that binds us together. We live in a vast country, and its vastness can inspire. But place means home, and home means heritage. For a place without a history is just a point on a map. Although our country is heterogeneous and most people spend their lives in one city or region, I do think identification with America and American heritage as a whole remains strong. Now, these considerations, diverse and sort of hopscotch as I may have been as I jump from one to the other, these considerations speak in favor of our continuing unity as a nation. Yet we should not discount the danger posed by our growing conflicts over fundamental truths, because this conflict cannot help but reduce civic friendship. As St. Thomas teaches, true worship is a requirement of justice. For Christians, of course, this means the worship of God, who reveals himself in Christ Jesus. And for Catholics, the Church is the most reliable guardian of revelation. In this regard, we have to admit, America has never been a community that shared the highest and most important love. John Courtney Murray, who Fran Mayer quoted, recognized the limits of civic friendship in the United States, and he foresaw that we may become aliens in a strange land, as the striking passage that he quoted in his talk yesterday indicates, the striking passage about Frankenstein, that you meet not with baptismal waters, but rather with a bludgeon. To my mind, it's not a matter of integralism versus liberalism. Murray theorized the bases of a civic friendship that, while not perfected by unity in worship, was nonetheless real, because it rested on shared moral and metaphysical commitments. It's that imperfect but real foundation that has dramatically eroded. As Fran noted, Murray would find unrecognizable the America of today, a regime that insistently waves the rainbow flag, the world's most visible symbol of the anthropological error that underwrites the culture of death. So I kind of find myself unsure how to end this talk. Polarization reflects a crisis in the literal sense of that term, a time when we must make a decision. Either the old consensus about nature and nature's God, that echo from the Declaration of Independence, which I think is what Murray theorizes, and we hold these truths. Either this old consensus will reassert itself and return in one form or another of natural law, maybe more explicit this time around, in order to establish the foundations of our polity, or we will become a society in which a substantial majority, now propagandized on all fronts, accept the progressive consensus that denies the authority of nature, even the authority of truth, all in order to liberate us, or promising to liberate us to remake all things, including our humanity. Or to remake all things, including our humanity. Or maybe there's a third possibility. Perhaps this is the most likely outcome. The metaphysical divide will become more evident, more entrenched, and more bitter, in which case civic friendship will continue to erode, and what remains of democracy will be swallowed by the ethos of empire. Because empires win their legitimacy by delivering material benefits, and they do not require the participation of citizens. You don't have to have civic friendship in order to have an empire, in other words. And we're well on our way, I think, to a post-democratic kind of America as the center of used to be a global empire, but I think the Chinese and Russians have a different plan for that. But it's nonetheless transcends national borders, for sure. Yet, in spite of those dark thoughts, I remain hopeful. Life rarely runs along the rails of pure logic. As Aristotle reminded, and Carl ended on this with people just they don't often follow their ideas to a bitter end. As Aristotle reminds us, friendship admits of degrees. Constitution, creed, language, and heritage are things we honor, admire, and cherish. They're not things that we use. They can remain bases for even a weakened civic friendship, which, while imperfect and vulnerable to the corrosive effects of bitter division over first things, is nevertheless a real civic friendship. Strengthening these foundations of civic friendship is not inconsistent with an unrelenting partisanship on the main question of the kind of country we want to become, partisanship around the question about what it means to be human. Too many people falsely claim that the way forward requires centrism. That mentality has allowed progressivism to dictate the terms of national debate for far too long. But I submit we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can celebrate our system of government, the American creed, our language, and our heritage while strategizing about how to roll back pornography, strengthen marriage, defeat the LGBT juggernaut, fund school choice, and many other goals that are related to trying to restore the authority of nature in our polity. And in conclusion, I'd just say we have our work cut out for us. I'm not optimistic in a Pollyannish sense. But that's always true for those who are called to make things a little better, or perhaps just a little bit less bad in the time God has given us between Jesus' ascension and his return again in glory. Thank you.
Thank you. We have plenty of time for questions. Father Dominic.
Thank you very much, Rusty. Great talk. It's very provocative, and I've got a million of questions, but I'm going to narrow it down to one. My question concerns how it is that the church, especially the church's ministers, can navigate this partisanship, this arena that we're in, especially when, as you framed it, the partisanship does turn on questions of anthropology. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. There's one letter in particular where Screwtape is advising his, novice demon. His patient has been enamored with the cause of pacifism to some extent. And the demon says, well, there's a trick here. The first thing is to, he'll see pacifism as maybe related to his Christian identity. And, and then your goal as a demon is to get him to see it as the most important thing about being a Christian. And then, if you really got him, you make it so that Christianity is convenient as serving the cause of pacifism. So you kind of invert the ultimate loyalty through this progressive commitment to a cause. So I guess the question, I think maybe I could speak for myself. I'm always cautious about being seen as partisan. As a minister of the church, I don't want to be, fall into one particular political divide in the country and just kind of be then have my ministry be a little, kneecapped in a way. And yet these issues are partisan issues, as you've pointed out. So how does the church then maintain kind of, can we transcend the partisan divide in some way and yet speak prophetically to issues that will align very strongly with one side of that divide? How do we do that well?
I sympathize very much with pastors in the present context. I'm very sympathetic, precisely because this is not a question of tax policy or it's not even a prudential question about going to war. I think just war principles are, they have to be implemented through prudential judgment, and transgender, and there's some matters of prudential judgment about the use of law to prevent, wrongful things from happening, and so on. So there's room to steer clear, but the sexual revolution really just goes right to these core metaphysical convictions, without which Christianity, without the doctrine of the resurrection, the bodily resurrection becomes a kind of it becomes a sort of absurd. Like, who cares about that? And if nature has no say, so to speak. So you do you can't, you can't avoid it because it's coming into the church, right? And so what are you going to like not catechize people so that you can avoid controversy? That would be kind of crazy. So I found that what I found is that what's very effective is affirmations. You preach on Genesis 2, and you just expound. You expound the difference between a man and a woman. You just expound it, and I guarantee you, people in the pews know what you're doing. They don't. They know. They feel a great consolation that you, as an authority, speaking for the church, are reassuring them that they're not crazy. And you're not telling them, vote for that bill, vote against that bill, this is bad, 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 bad. I think that probably doesn't, that does kind of, suddenly it all becomes, the message then becomes hard for many, many people to hear. And then you wind up getting co-opted by political actors who see this as a tool to win office, which is always a real serious threat and problem. So I hope that, I mean, your confreres, I go to St. Vincent Ferrer, they do a very good job of this from the pulpit. They're not saying this is bad. Instead, at the relevant moments, we just get straightforward teaching that is diametrically opposed to the implicit teaching of the transgender ideology and many other bad things that are happening in our society. So that, and then also, I just think, just preaching the resurrection, I think that's a really, like, whoa, and the real presence. And one of the things that really anguished me during the pandemic was the church's just capitulation and like, whoa, don't you realize that this is its own kind of trial. We did a trial period of having disembodied Christianity. And, that's a bad message in a world that thinks we can determine our own gender. I mean, if we had a world that didn't have all that ideological thing and it happened, I could be more nonchalant. But it just reinforced the very worst aspects of that Gnostic sensibility. So I would say, processions, physical things where you claim territory in the world is a way of sacramentally catechizing people about the reality of embodiment.
Thank you very much.
Rusty, I was intrigued with the opening remarks about the kind of battle between two forms of American Christianity, and I've often thought that, I think it was George Parkin Grant who talked about the secularization of Protestantism leading to a progressive, I think he called it the responsibility that could know no rest. I think so I think there's a sense in which maybe the secularization of liberal Protestantism, maybe liberal Protestantism is already a kind of secularization or semi-secularization of Protestantism. But I'd be interested if you thought about, Ross Douthat has said several years ago, he said, to the readers of the New York Times, if the Christian right upset you, wait till you see the post-Christian right. What happens when the heirs of the Second Great Awakening become secularized, and is that already happening?
Oh, it's definitely happening, I think. I think you get right. You get a different version of power. If nature is just the raw material, which I think is, and you mentioned Descartes and Bacon, the physical world is just raw material, and I think the post-Christian right, the sort of alt-right, traffics in the same assumption, and whereas the progressive left is a kind of disordered, G.K. Chesterton, you know, the vices of the modern world are Christian virtues gone mad. And so you get a certain kind of disordered charity that wants to destroy everything to include everybody. On the right, it'll be a much darker kind of, well, if it's really all just about power, then shouldn't the strong rule the weak? So, I mean, it seems to me in my dark moments, and I'm a kind of cheerful guy, but I do have my dark moments. And some of my dark moments, I fear like, well, yeah, if I'm the superannuated editor of First Things, and we're 10, 15 years down the line, and are we going to have to choose between the human rights campaign on the one hand and whatever the sort of Nietzschean triumph of the strong on the other hand? And I go, well, I'm going to have to go with the human rights campaign. You know, much as I think that was its own kind of destructive force in the West. I mean, is it going to be right? Yeah, if you had to choose between a kind of disordered conception of justice and a boot on people's neck, I think you choose a disordered conception of justice. By the way, the David Hollinger's got a new book out called The American Fate of Christianity, or Christianity's American Fate, or something like that. And you know, he's written scholarly articles on documenting, and this is his more accessible account of this basic thesis that the progressive, post-60s progressivism, it's not just conceptually connected to liberal Protestantism, but institutionally connected to liberal Protestantism. And you know, it's just one kind of Anglo-Protestant fighting against another kind of Anglo-Protestant for the future of America, I think, and even in 2023. It's fascinating to me when I worked on this and realizing how incredibly continuous our cultural politics are in the United States.
Thanks for that. My question, you and I have talked about this, where I said that it's never been easier to teach in a way than it is now, teach the humanities, because the students know there's something that's amiss. In a way that when I first got here 20-something years ago, I used to say, you can't really teach where there's no existential urgency. And our students had none, as far as I could tell. Maybe personal, but nothing intellectual. But now that's no longer true. And so there's a way in which the affirmation or the strong statement or the things that Carl was talking about, you asked certain tough questions, and again, easier now than it was 5 years ago, because the students see the urgency of the question. But the other issue is something that's always been a strong point of Catholicism, which is the idea that these notions could be discussed and even argued about. And as you said, the real change, and I think this is a qualitative, not a quantitative change, is that the other side knows that, well, they realize that they have enough power to crush and therefore not to converse. We've had our own struggles at this college trying to get people it's very easy to get the conservatives on the stage if we want to have some sort of debate or, disputatio. The other side, not so easy, because they feel they have all the power. And so it would be a diminution of power to get into a discussion. And that is a problem. It's a problem for certainly the Catholic understanding of these natural law and faith and reason and harmony and that kind of thing. So
I think there's another deeper dimension. I mean, you could say that when William Jennings Bryan's view of the human person, which was basically authoritative, it may not have had the same biblical trappings, but it was authoritative in our society, well into the 1960s represented a kind of open challenge to it. It had been challenged by other, but it was the first kind of really open cultural challenge to that, and it had authority, but it's different, you know, to the Baconian project, the progressive Baconian project is to remake everything. I mean, so to do that, you have to clear the ground. You have to burn away the weeds or burn the forest so that you can plow the fresh ground. And so this is why there's so much policing of even our own very thoughts. That has to be cleared out of the way so we can get on with this project of transforming the human condition. Whereas the Bryan view is that you have to tend the garden of nature. You don't have to, right? You have to have laws. You have to restrict things that threaten the garden. You have to, but if you plant things, they just grow. They grow, and it's different from the progressive view. So that I think makes them intrinsically more activist and now I think it is a case that there's a kind of impatience. It's like, we're done now. Everybody knows that this is the project of the post-Christian West, we had, you had, for the Bacon project, you got to torture nature in order to have her reveal her secrets so that we can use our knowledge of nature to relieve man's estate. And that was a kind of nature as in the laws of the way reality works. And Comte in the 19th century applied that to society. We got to figure out what the laws of society are so that we can remake society to make it more suitable for the human condition. And now we're at a stage where we have to remake our humanity so that our humanness itself is more suitable for us. And so, I mean, whether it's the CRISPR technology, we're very close, I think, to arguments. We already have it. We already have effectively genetic engineering in Europe with use of abortion to eliminate Down syndrome children. So the Europeans are already engaged in a kind of a perfection of the human species. It's all done under the sign of choice. That's the nature of this regime. Everything's under the sign of choice. But I think 20 years from now, the technology, professional women will have children through artificial means. Their gestation will be done artificially. And that will allow a great deal more intervention, medical intervention, and also testing to find out who the defective ones are so they can be eliminated. And that people who have babies the natural way will be shamed for being irresponsible. It'll be like not wearing a mask in 2020. You're an enemy of humanity. And they'll be treated like smokers. And because it'll all be done on the sign of choice, people won't be coerced to do it, but we'll have all kinds of propaganda and social engineering to get women not to have children, not to gestate their own children. Because I just think that's why elites get behind boys and girls' bathrooms. You would think, like, why would somebody running a Fortune 500 company throw his weight behind something such a stupid thing? Why would the people who are rich and living on the East Side be so behind this? Because it's integral to that project. We have to get over any notion that our bodies constrain us and define us, and that somehow carrying the child is somehow integral to what it means to be a woman. And we have to get over that. There is nothing about your body that defines what it means to be a man or a woman. And that'll make our bodies available to science and technology. And technocrats who want to organize social engineering in order to get us all to do the right thing with our bodies. So I think that's coming, and that's the sense in which you young clergy are going to be drawn into this, whether you want to or not. And I do think it's going to require really a lot of prayer and prudence to make sure that you're not drawn in at the wrong time and in the wrong way. But at some point, it will just be impossible, not for the Catholic Church not. The Catholic Church is the only institution in the West that has not, only significant institution in the West. I mean, the Protestant churches, conservative Protestant churches, don't function as an institution in the same way, but we're the only major institution in the West that has not signed a concordat with the sexual revolution. And sexual revolution that's a synecdoche for this much larger project of turning the human person into a science project for its improvement. We are the only major institution. The Germans are trying now desperately to sign a concordat. I think of it as like, wow, we could look back, and 20 years from now, your students, Jim, maybe they're sensing it. People would look back and think like, wow, who are the evil people who agreed to this? And I think it's really crucial for the church not, however we navigate in order to try to avoid conflict, it's just crucial not to sign that concordat. I mean, silence is vastly preferable to sort of capitulating.
A quick story that I assure you does have a point. I have a group of friends with whom I have kept in touch for many years. We Zoom once a month and email exchange and such, and get together when we can, although we're geographically dispersed. I would describe them, leaving some nuance aside, as your basic central casting, educated, secular liberals, most of whom would live in what Charles Murray calls super zips, so like the East Side. And a couple of Zooms ago, it was in the wake of one of these horrific mass shootings, and the discussion centered on we need more gun control. And this anecdote is not about gun control per se. It's just an example. And often I jump in and give a counter argument. And what I would like to have said in this instance was, hey guys, don't you think there's something more going on here? Don't you think that it's remarkable that this sort of thing didn't really happen 60 years ago, but you've been spending the last 60 years purposely breaking down the kind of mediating institutions that provided the moral framework within which social glue was held together in the name of the kind of really bad anthropology that you've been talking about. And when you produce an atomistic and amoral culture, it has atomistic and amoral individuals who do horrific things because they're...
Yeah, most of them just smoke pot and watch pornography, but there's a certain number that do violent things.
Okay, and guys...
Most are happy to be self-destructive, sadly.
So do you think you might be treating the symptoms but not the actual cause? Now, why didn't I jump in? Because if I had, they would have been utterly bewildered, because they would have had no frame of reference, because, and they don't call it the echo chamber for nothing. The echo chamber, the media and the social media that they spend time in does not talk about culture in the way that we do. And it doesn't, they don't read Fran Meyer and Carl Truman, and they're not rafters, they're in their own silos, and they talk about other things. And so I guess the upshot, the question is, all right, how do we have civic engagement across what are often just completely different communication silos and find some common understanding? It just seems very, very difficult.
I mean, all of us, depending on our backgrounds, many of us share the same experience. I certainly share it with many of my college classmates. Yeah, and you Carl, I think, is right. I mean, at some point, people don't really respond to arguments. So some people do. A very small number of people actually respond to arguments. Most people change their minds. John Henry Newman, in his Oxford University sermons on faith and reason, voices melt us, persons influence us. It's not the arguments ultimately that make the day. It's a kind of I guess it's witness. So that certainly has to be part of how we, and then as Carl said, you have to forge a different way of life. Certainly one of the bright spots in the current time is that the pandemic certainly made a lot of, your friends are, people our age don't have school children anymore, but they might have grandchildren in school, and certainly their children who have children in school, people are like, whoa, wait a minute, in 2020, 2021, a lot of kind of mushy-headed liberal, go with the flow, well-to-do parents were shocked to realize how bad things were in the schools. And so there's an upsurge in interest now in our schools, that are being founded Christian classical schools. And this is a great opportunity. There'll be 10 times as many students enrolled in these schools, I think, by the end of the decade than there are now. And so that's obviously a very good sign. And Jim was mentioning that the students are kind of aware, like, well, something's wrong. Help me think about this. The problem is that what I experience is people my age, I was born in 1959, but even if you go a little bit more peak baby boomers grew up in the time of the greatest homogeneity in our society's history in terms of this incredibly consolidated middle-class consensus. And, and then they could do all their adventures and radical thinking against the background of tremendous amount of social capital that they inherited from their parents. And, if you're 18 years old today, you don't have it anywhere, you don't have that. Even if you're from an intact family, you're really, really aware of how fragile everything is. And so that also augurs change in how our society thinks about these things. That's the hopeful side of things, it seems to me. That I did write an article, Cursed by Baby Boomers. So.
On that note, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.